Hello, and welcome to the presentation on cultural relativism. This presentation, as with all others, should not be expected to cover every detail in the text. The presentations, much like real-time classroom presentations, are meant to help cover the most important points as well as the most difficult points. But you are, of course, responsible for everything in the assigned readings. It is also important to do the readings before viewing the lectures. If you haven't already done the Rachel's and Benedict reading on cultural relativism, you should stop the presentation now and return when you have done so. This is actually very important. Studies show that students gain more from material if they read it first. Many students think that if material is difficult, they do better if it is explained to them before they do the readings. But this just turns out to be false. The research just doesn't bear it out. Even if one doesn't fully understand what one is reading, it will click when viewing the lecture if one has struggled with the material. This will not happen in the same way if you do not read the material first.
So, what is cultural relativism? You are all probably familiar with the idea of cultural relativism of one form or another, even if you don't know it by that name. It is based largely on the idea that different cultures have different cultural practices, and this includes holding different types of behaviors, traits, and skills to be morally valuable. For example, in many countries, arranged marriages are seen to be perfectly acceptable or even a parent's moral duty to their son or daughter. In the U.S., this isn't so. When confronted with a difference like this in the U.S., you might have heard somebody say something like the following. Oh, it would be morally outrageous to arrange for a woman to marry a man she barely knows for us here, but it is right for them. They are not morally wrong for doing it. If that sounds familiar, then you have already been exposed to the general concept of cultural relativism. Cultural relativists believe that what is or is not moral actually differs from one culture to another. On this page in the next, we will find some links to examples of cultural differences. The video clips are not lengthy, so please view them. For most versions of PowerPoint, if you move the cursor to the bottom of the screen, you can pause the video. You can then click on the image to open the link in a new browser window. Once finished, you can return to the presentation, click inside, and play should resume. I will count down from 5 to give you a moment to pause. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. This slide also contains 2 links to video clips on cultural differences. Please view them. I will again count down from 5 to give you a moment to pause. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Defining cultural relativism. As a theory about morality, cultural relativism can be defined as follows. Cultural relativism. The view that what is moral and immoral are solely determined by the cultural norms of the relevant culture. Several things follow from this. First, morality is real. This is important. Cultural relativists view morality as real. In any given culture, there really is a morally right and wrong thing to do. Next, moral judgments only have meaning within a culture. So, even though morality is real, moral terms only have meaning within that culture. All moral judgments are completely determined by the culture they are a part of. Finally, all moral judgments are completely determined by the practices of that culture. That is to say, morality is entirely defined by one's culture, and what is or is not moral depends upon that culture. In other words, rather than being objective, morality is relative to one's culture. So, according to cultural relativists, morality is real, but what is moral is different in the United States in the 21st century than it is in Iran. It is even different in the U.S. in the 21st century than it was in the U.S. in the 1900s. What is moral differs from time to time and place to place. Nevertheless, within a culture, one can make real, valid moral judgments. Moral terms do have meaning. This makes cultural relativism different from moral skepticism, which is that moral terms have no meaning at all. Benedict, a cultural anthropologist, interjects the idea of cultural relativism into her piece by saying, "We do not any longer make the mistake of deriving the morality of our locality and decade directly from the inevitable constitution of human nature. We recognize that morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. In other words, according to cultural relativism, what is morally correct is nothing more than socially approved habits, or if you prefer, the social norms of that culture. So this would mean what is moral or immoral depends entirely on the culture in which an individual does an action. Rachel's, for example, mentions how Eskimo tribes will sometimes leave infants or the elderly to die in the cold. Some cultures still execute people who are suspected of witchcraft, and the list could go on. The point is that cultural relativists would say that all these actions are moral if they are within the norms of their own cultures, no matter what we might think of them from the point of view of another culture. Now, if you recall, we will be breaking down all the major ethical theories we cover into what I last time called the anatomy of an ethical theory. This anatomy includes a concept of the good, meaning the morally good, a justification of why one should believe that the good is what the theory purports to be, a method of achieving the good, whether it is living a good life, being a good person, or doing morally good things, and finally a justification of why this method works to achieve the good. So now that we are reminded of that, let's try to apply the anatomy to cultural relativism. For cultural relativism, the anatomy breaks down in this way. The good, according to the theory, is whatever is endorsed by the relevant culture. Now remember that justifications are important in philosophy. The justification that is usually given for cultural relativism is simply that different cultures differ about morality. You might want to ask yourself how strong of a reason or justification this is. The next major section is the method for achieving or being good. For cultural relativism, this is simply to follow one's cultural norms, what is considered moral in that culture. The justification for this is pretty straightforward. If all there is to morality is what a given culture deems moral, then the only way to be moral is to obey one's cultural norms. So with this, we can see both the concept of the good according to cultural relativism and the method cultural relativism endorses for achieving that good. In addition, we can see the breakdown of the major justifications for this theory. Rachel's lists 5 claims that are often made by cultural relativists. I will list them again here. First, different societies have different moral codes. Second, the moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. That is to say, if the moral code of a society says that a certain action is right, then it really is right. Third, there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one society's code as better than another. There are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. Fourth, the moral code of our own society has no special status. It is but one among many. Finally, it is arrogant for us to judge other cultures. We should always be tolerant of them. The point here is to give you a cluster concept of what cultural relativism is, as well as list some of the primary views associated with it. It is important to note here that, as Rachel points out, it is not possible for a single cultural relativist to hold all 5 items on the list because some of them may contradict with each other. Specifically, item 5, which says we should, in a moral sense, always be tolerant of other cultures, contradicts the idea that could be expressed in 2 or 3 that says that there is no objective standard of right and wrong. This is because saying that it is wrong to judge other cultures implies that there is at least one objective standard of right and wrong. Indeed, one might argue that item 5 contradicts the very notion of cultural relativism itself if it is held as a moral claim and not just as an intellectual error. Putting aside the question as to whether or not cultural relativism is true for the moment, there are several reasons one might find cultural relativism attractive on the surface. First, it seems to make sense of many generations of moral disagreement. When considering morality, many people get frustrated at the apparent inability to garner agreement between groups with differing views, and some may take this as a reason to think that there is in fact no matter to agree upon. Second, cultural relativists often see themselves as being especially enlightened because this view prevents us from looking arrogantly down at other cultures and calling ourselves morally superior. Of course, when the view says we shouldn't judge other cultures because of how they dress, what they eat, and minor issues like this, it often seems a very tolerant theory. But objectors note that if torture, rape, slavery, and so forth are accepted in another culture, then the tolerance it implies seems far less noble and enlightened. It is true that a cultural relativist wouldn't morally condemn one culture for their table manners or manner of dress. This seems enlightened. But it is equally true that a cultural relativist could not morally condemn a culture that subjugates women or uses torture or brutally suppresses freedom of. Of course, no matter how many good reasons there may be to want cultural relativism to be true, or for it not to be true, the really important philosophical question is, are there any good reasons, arguments, or justifications to believe that it is? Cultural relativism, however, runs into some logical difficulties. Consider the argument. The premise: different cultures have different moral codes. The conclusion is, therefore, that there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only a matter of cultural norms, and these norms vary from culture to culture. This is what Rachel calls the cultural differences argument, the primary justification for cultural relativism. Now, one thing that is immediately clear is that there is no necessary connection between the conclusion and the premise. Continuing Rachel's example, we can make the following counterargument. First, we take the premise: different cultures disagree about the shape of the earth. Then suppose from this we try to reach the conclusion that therefore the earth has no objective shape. It varies from culture to culture. Now, this isn't a logic course, so we have not talked about all the logical forms. But one thing that is important to note is that validity is about the form of an argument. If an argument is valid, that means that if the premises are true, then its conclusion must be true as well. A valid argument isn't the same thing as a sound argument, which is a valid argument with true premises. What follows from this is that if two arguments have the same logical form, both arguments are valid. Now, look at these arguments. The premises are true in both of these arguments. Cultures have different cultural views about moral codes and about the shape of the earth. So, if the first argument is valid, the second must be valid as well. But a valid argument is one in which, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. This means that if the first argument is valid, and if the second argument is of the same form, and if the second argument has true premises, then the conclusion of the second argument must be true. But we know that the conclusion of the second argument is not true. The earth does in fact have a definite shape. Therefore, the second argument cannot be valid. Since the first and second argument have the same form, the first argument, therefore, cannot be valid either. Of course, it is important to understand exactly what the counter-argument says here. The counter-argument does not prove that cultural relativism is false. This is because cultural relativism could be true for a different reason than the cultural differences argument. What it proves is that the cultural differences argument is not a good reason to believe in cultural relativism. In other words, the counter-argument undermines the cultural differences as a justification for believing in cultural relativism. In order to support cultural relativism, a different argument would be needed. The cultural differences argument, however, is the primary reason cultural relativists give for believing in cultural relativism, so without another justification, the claim is undermined. There is another criticism of cultural differences argument. Note that to say something about the moral code of a culture is to say something about the beliefs of the people within that culture. But the conclusion that the argument tries to reach isn't about what cultures believe, it is about the truth or falsity of those beliefs. These are two entirely different types of things. One can't get a conclusion about a non-belief related fact from premises that only concern beliefs. In a valid argument, the premises need to relate to the conclusion. In other words, you couldn't get a conclusion about some type of category or thing B if your premises were only about another category of things, A. The flaws in the cultural differences argument, once broken down into premise and conclusion, might seem pretty obvious. Because of this, one might wonder why cultural relativists don't seem to see it for themselves. One possibility is that many people, something like whether incest is wrong, seems like a much different type of thing than the shape of the earth. The first may seem as if it is not an objective fact, while the second seems objective. This might turn out to be right. That is to say, cultural relativists or other theorists who say that there isn't an objective morality could be correct. They could also be incorrect. The important point here is that the cultural differences argument does not show that they are correct. Another reason may be that cultures not only seem to differ greatly in their moral codes, they usually seem to have no way to be brought into agreement with each other, as they might with something like the shape of the earth. But of course, agreement doesn't have anything to do with truth. There is a definite truth of the matter as to whether or not human beings landed on the moon, and the truth of this claim does not depend upon whether or not some moon landing deniers can ever be reasoned with or brought into agreement regarding the moon landing. In addition, Rachel challenges this reason to at least some extent by suggesting that other cultures may not differ as much as they first appear. One of the things that may contribute to making the cultures in Benedict's piece, as well as those discussed at the beginning of Rachel's chapter, seem so strange, is that these pieces describe behavior. Rachel hypothesizes that if instead of looking at the behavior of the people in these cultures alone, and instead we look at the motivation of the people producing the behavior, we would actually find a lot more common ground. Rachel points out, for example, that Eskimos that kill healthy infants or leave the elderly behind to die do so because of the conditions they live under, which are so harsh. It turns out that Eskimos love their children and would protect them if conditions and food supply made it possible. Infanticide was a desperate but all too frequent necessity to ensure a family's survival. Now, some might say that they would let the whole family die before killing one member, while others disagree. But notice that once the issue and motivation is more clearly understood, it seems like one upon which rational people could disagree without being morally bankrupt monsters. Rachel goes even further and argues that some moral values are shared by all cultures. Which values? Ones that are necessary for just about any culture to continue to exist at all. Such values would include protecting the young, rules for truth-telling, prohibitions against murder, and so forth. If the young were not protected, the culture would not last long. Cultures need communication, but without an expectation of truth-telling, communication becomes meaningless. If people killed each other whenever they pleased, there would be very little cooperation, individuals would avoid each other, and under such conditions, a culture would not thrive or spread far. In other words, what Rachel is saying is that the differences between people in different cultures and the way they behave may be the result of very similar moral motivations. Morality may not differ that much from culture to culture after all, but instead what may differ are beliefs about how the world works. Okay, that wraps up this lecture presentation. Here's a brief summary of the key points. First, the definition of cultural relativism, the view that morality exists, but that right or wrong depend entirely on the practices of the relevant culture. Second, the cultural differences argument. This seems to be the main argument for cultural relativism. It claims that because cultures differ in terms of their moral values do not exist objectively and are determined by those cultures. Third, the criticism of the cultural differences argument. The argument illegitimately moves from premises entirely about beliefs about morality to a conclusion about a fact about morality. One way to see the flaw in the reasoning is to replace moral values or codes with something else, like shape of the earth, or distance from LA to Paris, or the sum of 6 and 4. And then there is the additional criticism Rachel makes, which is to note that though behaviors vary widely between cultures, the moral motivations and reasoning between cultures is not that different. He thinks that one major reason for this is that some codes are necessary for a culture to continue to exist at all. Until next time.